Barbara, are you going to get the UK editions as well?
Yeah, there's 100 of them on order from Goldsboro.
Okay, so I can hold this one up as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we are live.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or if you're in the UK, good evening. What a treat it is, and what an absolute pleasure to host Ian Rankin in advance of the publication of the 24th John Rebus novel, A Heart Full of Headstones. I'm going to ask Ian to tell us about this title in a minute, but it seems asinine for me to actually introduce Ian Rankin to anybody watching this. But what I could say, aside from his numerous awards, his honorary degrees, all around good guy and all, is that now I have to call him Sir Ian. And I suspect that he is OBE, so all of us would now have to do some kind of a little curtsy?
Yeah, I've not, you know what, I don't know anything about this. I don't really know what it entails. I've not actually been knighted yet. You've got to go to Buckingham Palace and they sort of put a sword on your shoulder. And it will happen sometime early next year, but it hasn't happened yet. No, I mean, it was a great thing. I looked at, I wondered which Scottish male authors have been honoured in this way. And the most recent one I could find was Sir Compton Mackenzie in the 1960s. And probably before him, Arthur Conan Doyle. So you've got to go back a ways, and you certainly don't get too many working class, blue collar kids from a council estate in Fife getting knighted for their services to literature. So very happy.
I sounded like I was sort of being flip about it, but I wasn't. I thought you might be being. But let me back up and say this. Are you disappointed that it won't be Queen Elizabeth?
Yeah, I am. I'm hugely disappointed. That would have been the cherry on the cake, really. She was in Edinburgh in August, and I thought, maybe I'll get a phone call saying, just come round, just nip round, and we'll do it now. But it didn't happen. So it will probably be King Charles, and it'll probably be in Buckingham Palace sometime in the spring, if the good Lord spares me.
Well, I suspect he will. And many felicitations. The reason I made that kind of flip remark is that I remember you said that one of the reasons to accept it was so Alexander McCall Smith would have to kind of salute you.
I mean, how do you explain this arcane system to American readers? There's this kind of honor system, and it's really a hierarchy. And for a while I was an OBE, an officer of the British Empire, but Alexander McCall Smith, my one-time neighbor, lived in the same street as me. He was a CBE, which was one higher up. So now I've leapfrogged him, and I'm now one higher up than him. And I've got to say that, bless him, just a day or two after it was announced that I was going to get the knighthood, he wrote a lovely card or a letter just to say how thrilled he was. So he's one of the good guys. Although I don't see very much of him these days, he is one of the good guys.
Well, a person who has won, let me think, 4 daggers, including the Diamond Dagger, the Edgar, been nominated for umpteen other awards, many of them foreign, translated into, let me see if I'm calling from this, 36 languages, and has had numerous radio, screen, and other adaptations, including some you've written yourself, Ian. It seems only reasonable and right that you would be recognized for that. So, I heard once that every minute or every whatever it is, somebody was buying an Ian Rankin novel to read. Some phenomenal.
I think those days are long gone. I think that was true in the UK for a short time when the Rebus books took off. And you know this, Barbara, the Rebus books were not an overnight success.
Oh, no,
they weren't
even
an over-year success. It took the best part of a decade before I was selling in any quantity. But when they started to sell, people who'd enjoyed the newest one would go back and read all the previous ones. So yeah, there was a time when the books were selling a healthy amount. There was at one point where the Scottish bestseller list, I think 8 of the top 10 were me, and the other 2 were J.K. Rowling. So it wasn't bad company to be in, but I think those days are long behind me now. Things have calmed down somewhat. Well, I've calmed down somewhat.
No, you haven't. I know that Black and Blue was your gold dagger winner, and definitely a triumph. But I will say, since we're reminiscing here, that Ian and I have a very long history that goes all the way back to Ian was at one point not a Fulbright, what was it, a Raymond Chandler Fellow here?
Yeah, Chandler
in the United
Fulbright.
States. Yep. And I first met him at his first VoucherCon, the International Mystery Convention, early in the 90s in Seattle. And the only reason I knew him is that a then yet unpublished author called Diana Gabaldon kept ordering Ian's books from the Boys and Batted. I had to import them from Scotland. So we kind of went on from there. We've had coffee in Edinburgh. He's been to visit us in Scottsdale alone with his wife. And we happily, on the occasion of his 30th John Rebus novel, which was right before the pandemic, Ian was the guest of honor at VoucherCon. But he said to me, let's do something wonderful for the book in Phoenix. So we had a convention just for Ian at the Arizona Biltmore, and James Salas came to talk to him, and Hank Philippi Ryan flew out to do things, and it was great, wasn't it, Patrick? I thought, yes, Ian, I thought your guest of honor speech at that was possibly the best conversation, best literary speech I've ever heard. There were people crying in the audience, including me.
Wow. You know what? I don't remember it too well because I'm getting a little bit long in the tooth now. And I don't really do speeches. I'm not a great one for getting up and doing public speeches. So, well, that's nice. Nice to hear. That's nice to hear. What we're talking about, to go back to this knighthood thing, knighthood is for services to literature. And it's always been important to me that crime fiction be perceived in the wider world as literature, not a kind of lesser child or a child of a lesser god. But the best crime fiction, I think, holds a mirror up to us and to society, to our cultures, the way that the great literature does through the ages. And I'm always thrilled when people, are studying my books at colleges and universities or in high schools, because I do think that. I mean, I didn't start in this business thinking of myself even as a crime writer. You know this. When I started out, I was doing a PhD, and I wrote a crime novel trying to mimic or echo the themes that I had found in Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it was accidental that I chose a cop for my main character. But when I started reading crime fiction, because I was a late adopter, I didn't read it as a kid. But when I came to it, I got so much from it. I got that wonderful sense of place, great, strong characterization, a roller coaster plot, of course, but also big, meaty themes. And that's what's always appealed to me about crime fiction, is the way that it can tackle really big themes with a very light touch.
Well, you certainly do. And you have one of the things you've explored almost as a consequence of the choices you made early on for Rebus are themes of aging. What happens as you grow older? What happens to you professionally? What happens to you personally? The effect it has on your family, on your colleagues. Certainly your last book, I thought, was very profound that way, and A Song for the Dark Times. And now here we are with A Heart Full of Headstones. And both of those titles are, tinged with darkness. Ian is holding up the British edition, and because he is touring in Canada, but unless we can lure him here, which we might, off tour, we have ordered the British edition from London for those of you who want an autographed copy. This is the US edition. And Ian, it's interesting how different the covers are. Oh, what's that?
The kind of interior has this guy walking down an alleyway. I think it's Rebus with his back to us. Cool. So it's a nice little secret behind the actual jacket. It's a little nice secret. Yeah, but they've always been, American and UK editions have always had different jacket designs. The different publishers think different things work in different markets. I mean, I think the American edition is lovely. I mean, I like it a lot. In some ways, it's not dissimilar to quite a few of my UK books. They've also got this really old photograph of me with my finger glued to my chin. I did manage to get that unglued with medical assistance. But no, they've got these different styles that seem to work. What works in one country doesn't work in another. I've got shelves and shelves here of foreign language editions, and they're all different. All the cover designs are different. The photography, the graphics, even the titles, they don't always transliterate. They don't literally translate the title. They just do something a bit like it, but it's something that makes sense in that language. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me how different things work in different cultures. To get back to your point, I mean, yeah, Rebus is aging, and one of the big things I had to do in this book early on was to decide, would it be set in a time of COVID? I mean, every writer who's writing about contemporary times has to make that decision. Are they going to mention COVID? Will the book be set in a time of COVID? Will we just ignore COVID? And something happened. Lockdown had just finished in the UK, and I walked into a bar. Bars had been closed for like months. And I walked into a local bar and saw a guy that I knew, and he was wearing a lanyard with a kind of embossed plastic card attached to it. And I said, Charlie, what's that? And he said, oh, it tells people that I've got COPD. Therefore, I don't have to wear a mask in shops, in stores, and what have you, in pubs. I don't have to wear a mask. And I thought, oh, Rebus has COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. So he would also have one of these lanyards with his card. And I thought I could have some fun with that, because Rebus would try and use that, no longer a cop, he would try and use that to get past crime scenes. So if he's approaching a police cordon of a crime scene, he puts the old lanyard over his neck and he sort of holds it up towards the guy on the cordon and says, just visiting, and in he goes, thinking he'll get past the cops. It doesn't work. I've got to tell you right now, spoiler alert, it doesn't work. But I just thought that's quite a fun thing to do. Another thing was that decided me on COVID being the time when the book would be set, was that my son did jury service during COVID. And the way that they kept trials operating in the UK, or certainly in Edinburgh, was that the jury would be in a cinema. So there'd be a big cinema, and it was only for juries, and it was all cameras and screens and everything. And the trial was happening in the courtroom half a mile away, and there was nobody in the courtroom except the professionals who were involved in the trial. So that was how they kept people safe from COVID and managed to keep trials operating. And I just thought that's a really interesting scenario. So although my son couldn't, of course, talk to me about the case, he could tell me about who was wearing a mask, was anybody not wearing a mask, how did they operate the cameras and the screens and what have you. And I just thought that's real. This is a very different kind of crime, a very different kind of courtroom scene to the scenes that we're used to seeing in fiction. So those two incidents forced me to set the book when it is set.
And you took advantage of that, because when this book opens, John Rebus is in fact in the dock. He's on trial, but you don't tell us why. We have to work our way through the entire book.
Yeah, I can't, they'd kill me. My publishers would kill me if I told you why he's on trial.
Oh, we're not going to. No. I would
but you know what? He's done so many questionable things in his professional life. I thought there comes a time when there's got to be a knock at the door, and you end up, instead of giving evidence in court, you end up being in a dock. And I mean, again, that's because this book, and here's something we maybe will talk about later, or maybe we can talk about it right now. The kind of theme of this book, the gist of it comes back to how police procedural writers deal now with the fact that not everybody thinks of the cops as the good guys. That with Black Lives Matters in the States and elsewhere, and with some of the things we've seen in the UK with police forces recently, there's definitely a question now that all writers are having to ask themselves about how do we feel about presenting these people as the heroes of these books when, and not all of them are tarnished in real life. Of course, not all of them are tarnished, but some of them are, and palpably so. And our readers know that. Our readers see it online. They see video evidence of innocent people being attacked by cops. In the UK, there were a couple of cases just recently in London. Two police officers who were taking selfies at a murder scene. Two sisters had been killed, and they were taking selfies and joking about it and sharing them with fellow officers. And also in London, there was a serving police officer who killed a woman, Sarah Everard. He persuaded her into his car using his ID, his official police ID, and murdered her. So this story revolves, I've got a really bad police station in Edinburgh, completely fictitious. And one of the cops from there is being investigated. And he decides for another crime, for spousal abuse, for domestic abuse. He's been charged. So he says, look, I can give you let's do a deal here. I can open up a huge can of worms about the bad stuff this police station has been doing for decades. And everybody kind of knew about it, and everybody just let it go because we got results. And he starts to name names, and one of the names is John Rebus. And so that brings Rebus into a live police investigation.
And you were able then to bring back your line of duty guy. I'm having a blank here.
Yeah, Malcolm Fox. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so,
interesting you say line of duty, because next week in Edinburgh, I'm doing a big public event for the book, and Jed Mercurio, the brains behind Line of Duty, is going to be in conversation with me on stage. And that'll be a very different, again, I think this will come up, this conversation about cops not always being the goodies, I think will come up big time during that conversation. Yeah, Line of Duty is definitely something that was an influence on this book.
Well, it could hardly not be, in the sense that it was a real cultural phenomenon. I am told that in the last episode, life basically came to a halt in the UK while everybody was braced at their screen, trying to work it out. I thought the acting in it, I really loved the Irish guy. I thought he was absolutely amazing. But, it was a bit disheartening to recognize that the stuff they were for dramatic purposes, no doubt, that it wasn't limited, that there was this almost, sort of mushroom-like effect and that they had more than one corruption investigation unit. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think I thought that Fox was more sympathetic when you first introduced him than he is in this book, where everybody hates him. Did I miss something, or has he been on a sort of a downward trajectory?
I quite like him, but he is, we would say, a bit of a brown noser. He's somebody who likes to, get friendly with anybody who's more senior than him in the police. He will try and become their friend because they might advance his career. So he's a career politician in some ways. He's not a natural born detective. Right. He's a desk jockey. He's, put him behind a desk or get him running an office and he's fine, but don't put him out in the field. I've tried that with him in various books, and he's failed dismally or ended up almost being murdered himself. And yes, the kind of policing that I'm dealing with in this book, the kind of policing where a lot of corners are cut and people are bending the rules and getting away with it, is anathema to him. And because of the kind of work he has done in the past as a complaints officer, as a cop who investigates other cops, of course, every cop mistrusts him because they think he might be out to get them, or he might have some evidence on them hidden away somewhere in a file, or they might let something slip and suddenly he becomes their nemesis. So he's in a difficult position within the police. And also he's risen through the ranks rapidly because of all this sucking up that he does to his superiors. And that annoys people like Siobhan Clarke, who's been kind of feels she's been left behind, that she has been ignored. The glass ceiling still exists for women police officers in Scotland to a large extent. And she feels that he's, him and his buddies, him and his kind of backslapping, rugby playing, whiskey drinking buddies are in a kind of clique that is not dissimilar to the kind of clique that exists in my bad police station, where it's almost like a frat house, where these cops have just been running wild and getting away with it for years. But there's going to be a knock at the door for all of them. So I'm looking really at how policing has changed. And also the big question is, what kind of policing do we want? What kind of policing do we need? What kind of policing do we deserve? Now, when you talk about TV programs, there was another one in the UK a few years ago called Life on Mars. I don't know if you ever got that or saw it.
No, don't remember that.
And it was about a cop, a touchy-feely, postmodernist, feminist cop in contemporary UK. He's in a car accident and he wakes up and he's in the 1970s. He's a cop in the 1970s. And he's surrounded by these Neanderthals, these cops who just go around slapping suspects, drinking whiskey on duty, etc., etc. I think the TV audience were supposed to empathize with him, the modern cop, and tut, tut, tut at these 1970s Neanderthals. The opposite thing happened. Viewers loved these old maverick cops who would drink whiskey on duty and swear and have, smoke and slap around.
Uh-oh.
I think we've lost him. I was hoping it wasn't me.
No.
Ian, you may need to leave and come back.
Let's see. I'll send him a chat.
Okay.
Let's see.
It was in the middle of a wonderful point.
No.
Sorry, we've lost him.
Pause.
Bring him back. Yeah, there he goes.
Here he comes. Yep.
I wanted to ask him about the title because I think it's
That's
so.
such a great title. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll bring you my arc tomorrow. I know you're
I
perishing.
know I'm chomping at the bit.
I'm sorry. I know, but I needed it to do that.
I understand.
I would have.
That's why you haven't heard much from me, folks. I haven't read the book yet.
No, Patrick, I've been jealously hanging on to my advanced reading copy, which really is advanced given the fact that the book has been out for a while.
Yeah.
Normally, Patrick has actually preceded me in reading Ian Rankin. So there he comes.
Yeah. Don't let me forget. I want to ask him about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I want to pursue that just a little bit further.
You should, and particularly remember that Les is coming to sign his beautiful annotated version on Thursday.
Yeah.
When, I might add, we will have plenty more birthday cake to offer people. I'll be bringing
Boy, have we got birthday cake.
I know. Well, who knew that we were going to have a tornado just north of us? That's what happened. There was a tornado in Flagstaff and Williams, and we got the blowback from it, so. But, I saw that John has already had over 1,000 people watching. So, one thing about streaming, for those of you who are waiting for Ian to return here, is that it can save you from weather-related event disasters and other things, because sometimes people can't get to a live event, but they can then enjoy it during it or afterward.
This question here from Linda, who would like to know, anyone know where to find details of Ian Rankin's Canadian tour? I would assume his website would have that info, but let me check real quick here.
I don't really know. There he is.
Is he back?
You're back. Can't hear you. He's back, but without sound.
Let's see.
Do you need to unmute him?
I don't think I do. Can you hear us, Ian? No. Okay.
By the way, before we started, I was complimenting Ian on his haircut. This is a whole different look from Ian. If any of you happen to watch photos from Bloody Scotland, which is a crime conference that he does in the summer, this is an entirely different look.
There we go.
Oh, there you're back. Wonderful. We can.
What happened there? I don't know.
You froze mid-sentence.
I don't know, but
and you know what? It was the greatest sentence in the history of crime fiction.
Oh, and now it's lost. Do you remember where you were?
Don't ask me to repeat it.
Oh.
There is, before we get going too far, there's somebody watching who would like to know about your Canadian tour and where she can find information. I don't see it on your UK website.
I don't have any information yet. They've told me which cities I'm going to. I know which dates I'm going to those cities, but I don't exactly know where the events are going to be or what time they're going to start. I don't have that information yet from my Canadian publisher. So as soon as I get that information from my Canadian publisher, it will be on Twitter. It'll be on my Twitter feed. And almost certainly also on my UK website, ianrankin.net. But I don't have it yet.
Okay.
So we were sort of in the middle or coming to the end of a discussion about how readers perceive cops and what the ethics of the job are, whether, what we expect from them, what they expect from us. In the States, Ian, there have been a lot of defund the police sorts of projects, but if there are no police, then what happens? So it's an extremely complicated issue.
You were mentioning life on Mars
Oh, that was it. We were talking about the
Yeah.
TV show Life
Great.
and how the viewers liked the old guys
Yeah.
and didn't sympathize with the new ones as much.
Yeah, and I mean, as a result of that, my new book is sort of about that. It's about what kind of cops do we deserve, what kind of cops do we get, what kind of cops do we need. And people kind of like the Mavericks. People tend to like the Mavericks and rule breakers a little bit, as long as it's not you who's being put in a cell unnecessarily or being slapped about in the interview room. The thing is, bad cops can't get away with it the way they used to, because now everybody's got a camera. Everyone's has a phone camera. CCTV is everywhere in the UK. So it's much harder to get away with this stuff than it used to be, but it still goes on. And in Scotland, not that long ago, we had a black guy, Sheku Bayo, who was being arrested in Kirkcaldy in Fife, very near where I grew up, near where Val McDermott grew up, small town north of Edinburgh. And he ended up dead at the hands of, half a dozen police officers, and that's being investigated at the moment. So Scotland, small country, is not immune to the same issues that are exercising minds in the States.
Well, particularly, I think it comes over stronger, at least on TV from the UK and so forth. But, police to some degree are a paramilitary organization. I mean, there's a lot of rank and file and hierarchy and uniforms and all that kind of thing. And I wonder how much that allows people to get away with things, depending on whether they want to buck a superior or, there's been, things exposed about the military as well as the cops. But let me ask you this, because I really like this quote. You got as you frequently do, almost always, a great starred review here in the United States. And one of them says, the well-constructed plot is matched by brooding atmospheric prose. Rebus has, quote, spent his whole life in a city perpetually dark, feeling increasingly weighed down, his heart full of headstones. So what do you mean by that? What does your title mean in relation to this book?
Well, the title is taken yet again from a song by my good friend Jackie Leaven, who died too young. I was a fan of his music. He was a fan of my books. We worked together, made an album together, toured together, and then he died young. And I've been kind of keeping the flame alive as much as possible, including titling a fair number of recent books after his lyrics or misheard lyrics. So Saints of the Shadow Bible is a line from one of his songs. Standing in Another Man's Grave is a mishearing of one of his songs, which is Standing in Another Man's Rain. And now we've got Heart Full of Headstones. It's from a song of his called Single Father. Got a heart full of headstones as I stepped down from the train, I think is the line. And it just struck me straight away that this is Rebus. Rebus is the guy with a heart full of headstones. He's a guy who carries around the ghosts of every case he's worked, every victim he's had to deal with, every family he hasn't been able to give closure to, all the cases that are never quite solved. These are the kind of headstones, anonymous in many cases, so ill-defined because they've not been solved, that he carries around with him. And you've mentioned already, Barbara, that mortality is creeping along. He's no longer a young man full of vim and vigor. He's getting on for 70 years old. During COVID, he was having to lock himself down because having COPD meant he was in big trouble if he caught COVID. And so, so it's a book that really, mortality is has been a big part of the recent books. And I'm torn between what I do next. Let's not go there, but I'm torn between whether I go, what happens to him next in contemporary times, or do I go back and do a younger Rebus when he is a much more threatening and dangerous and brooding presence than he is in the later books.
Well, another character that we have followed through so much of Rebus's career is the gangster Big Jer. And so mortality and other things are questioned not just for Rebus, but for his principal nemesis. And there's a wonderful whole plot line in this book connected with him, which we won't explore. So basically what we open with is Rebus in the dock. And gradually over the course of the book, we learn why he's in the dock. And then the compelling question is, how will he plead? So it's a big ethical question for Rebus. And whether you're actively corrupt or whether you condone it or you just sort of look away from it, those are really tough questions, which I think that Ian deals with in this. So, Patrick, you've been lovely. I mean, as I said while you were gone, Patrick has been waiting on this, which I'm giving him tomorrow. But in the absence of reading it, what would you like to talk to Ian about?
Well,
I feel so guilty that I didn't give it to you sooner. But
that's okay. I'm chomping at the bit to read it. It's funny that you were just talking about the significance of the title, and I was thinking of an opening, very famous opening paragraph of a book, and it's I won't say the first line, but it says, some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand with me, et cetera, et cetera. Do you recognize that that page?
Well, I think it's Moby Dick. It's either Moby Dick or Heart of Darkness.
You're right. No, you're right.
Yeah, which is why. I mean, the clue was that you said, I'm not going to say the first line. That was a good clue.
But yeah, November in My Soul would be a good title.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to rip off titles, go for the classics, I always feel. But being a musician manqué, I tend to go for songs because that gets me closer to the musicians who made the music that I really love. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because it all seems to, this stuff all connects for me. The fact that Jackie Leaven died young and I've delved back into his work to get inspiration. The fact that my great friend and great writer, William McIlvanney, left us slightly too soon because he had started a book but not managed to finish it, featuring his legendary Glasgow detective Laidlaw, who I cribbed basically for Rebus in the early days. And I was able to give some closure to that by being asked by his widow to finish the book that he had started. All these things seem to connect in my mind, all these intimations of mortality are there. And having made Rebus a little bit older than me, whenever I have to sit and think about Rebus, I'm always thinking, okay, Ian, how are you going to be in 10 years' time or 8 years' time? What changes will have happened in your life? How much slower will you be? Is your hearing gone? Have you got early onset dementia? Where are you? What's happening to you? So yeah, I mean, without getting too depressed, the thing is I can give all these issues to my character, so I can give all of that to Rebus, and that's very cathartic. It's a way of me dealing with it. Giving intimations of mortality and people dying around him. I can have that happen to Rebus, and it's a way of me asking myself, how do I feel about this? And it's a way of sort of dealing with it. And it's been very useful to me down the years, Patrick. It saved me a fortune in psychoanalysts' fees.
I wanted to ask you, just kind of going back to the very beginning, Barbara and I were chatting about it. One of my absolute favorite all-time, very short little books is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you alluded to it earlier. Tomorrow night, Leslie Klinger, the great raconteur.
Not tomorrow, Thursday.
Is it Thursday? Thursday.
Anyway.
Anyway, Leslie Klinger, anthologist, manqué, raconteur, has this beautiful new edition of the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Anyway, I wanted to ask you, it seems to me that very slim story by Stevenson, and Bartleby is another one that comes to mind, of very short pieces that have incredible resonance today, and they're both very contemporary stories. Can you talk about Jekyll and Hyde? You mentioned it, how it was an influence early on.
It was a huge influence on me, but I've kind of got to take a few steps back. I was at university in Edinburgh. I was doing a PhD on the novels of Muriel Spark. Muriel Spark wrote a wonderful book called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Miss Brodie tells us in that very slim book that she is descended from a real life guy called William Brodie. She tells us he was a gentleman, he was a craftsman, he was well respected in Edinburgh. All true. What she doesn't tell us or her pupils, because Miss Brodie is a school teacher, is that William Brodie was gentleman by day but thief by night, and was eventually hanged on a scaffold in Edinburgh that he had crafted because he was a carpenter. Now, not only did he craft the scaffold on which he was hanged, he also crafted, many years before that, a wardrobe that was in Robert Louis Stevenson's childhood bedroom and can now be seen in the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh. And Robert Louis Stevenson, as a sickly child, spent a lot of time in bed, and his nursemaid told him the story of this guy who was both good and evil contained in the same person. So this is all connected. This is all connected. And Jekyll and Hyde is a book that seems to me to resonate because it is very much, although it's set in London, it's very much about Edinburgh. It's very much about the nature of Edinburgh, the fact it's a city of great wealth and great poverty, of haves and have-nots, of scientific endeavor, but also people who are out for only themselves, vagabonds and killers and thieves and everything else. And it's a small city. It's a very tightly contained city. And yet it has all these issues within it, structurally within it, because it has the new town and the old town, a new town rationally planned in the late 18th century. The old town higgledy-piggledy and chaotically no design at all, just houses went up wherever they thought they could build a house. And that's the old town, which is where I live. Mostly have lived, most of my life I've lived in the old town, not the new town. So you've got the kind of irrational and irrational, the scientific and the kind of the pagan. All of this is within the stones of Edinburgh. So it's brilliant for a crime writer. All crime novels that are set in city locations throw up the underbelly. They show us the underbelly of that culture and that civilization. But in Edinburgh, it's physically there. You can actually see it as you walk down the streets. You can see the underworld and the overworld staring at you, depending on which street you're walking down. So yeah, Jekyll and Hyde has been a really important book to me. And of course, it's also about human nature. It's about what causes human beings to do terrible things to each other. And that is absolutely a question that crime fiction is built on.
There's the whole notion of the shadow, the shadow side or the shadow self. And
yeah, I mean, if you do a degree in Scottish literature, as I'm sure you will, Patrick, in the fullness of time,
I think that ship has sailed.
These doppelgangers are everywhere in Scottish literature. Doppelgangers, different selves, different aspects of the self. The fact that Jekyll can also be Hyde. There's an even earlier book than that called Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg, in which a young man, a religious zealot, is persuaded by a charismatic, charming stranger that he is a member of the elect and will go to heaven, whatever he does on earth. So he can go out and just do whatever the heck he wants, including killing his brother, killing a church minister, etc., etc. And this charming stranger starts to shape change. We go, is this a figment of your imagination, young man? Or is it the devil? Or is he a psychopath? Who is this? So you've got these wonderful books, and Miss Jean Brodie as well, really. Muriel Sparks' great creation is both hero and villain of that story. So yes, Scottish literature is full of these doppelgangers, and Rebus and Cafferty, the gangster, really represent the Jekyll and Hyde. Mm-hmm. They represent the yin and the yang, the Cain and Abel, two sides of the same coin. They're almost brotherly in some ways, but they're also inveterate enemies. So they're brotherly enemies, and I found that fascinating.
Do you see that also? And this is, forgive me, folks, to be self-indulgent, but I got to ask you a little bit about Derek Raymond, because I know that you knew him early on. But it strikes me that some of this comes up in He Died with His Eyes Open as well. That kind of dualistic nature.
Derek Raymond's books were very much, they were kind of very Gothic or Grand Guignol. They were rooted in Elizabethan tragedy, not Shakespeare as such, but all the people who came after who were kind of had horrible things happen in their plays, full of blood and guts and terrible people doing terrible things. And there's a certain Jacobean horror to the short novels that he wrote in his lifetime. I mean, my favorite, as you know, is I Was Dora Suarez, which is a once read, never forgotten, a very short, sharp, horrible book, but a book that almost demands your attention and you can't tear your eyes away from it, even though you want to. Yeah, he was a guy who looked beneath the skin. He saw beneath the skin. And I remember meeting him once in a bookstore in London, and just staring into his eyes there were depths there that I didn't want to get too close to. This was a guy who had seen and possibly even done things that would be better left unsaid or unknown.
Didn't you say you had the same reaction looking into Keith Richards' eyes when you met him?
Very similar milky blue eyes. The pair of them had these very similar eyes, deep set. Both, of course, had taken drugs in their time. But yeah, you could tell that Keith had seen and done things that perhaps were best left to him and his conscience.
Then before I hand it back over to Barbara, getting back to Edinburgh, just in these last few years, I remember I think we put them on the screen for everybody to see, but those surreal photographs you took of COVID era Edinburgh. The streets are completely deserted. Very powerful. Yeah. And you said, this is not something I thought I would ever see in my lifetime. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I something I wouldn't want to see in my lifetime, something I wouldn't be keen to repeat, but an extraordinary experience to be able to walk through the center of the city, usually thronged with tourists, and there be literally nobody there, no traffic. You could hear birdsong in the middle of the city. You could hear birdsong, something you can normally never hear because of the traffic and the hubbub. You could walk up to the castle gates in July, and there'd be nobody there. The gates, of course, were the main gates were locked. It was, and you could walk down these little alleyways. And normally I would steer clear of these alleyways because they're usually too thronged with tourists. It was uncanny. It was uncanny, but it did make me think: is a city if there are no people in it, or is it just a museum? It was like walking through a museum at midnight when there's nobody else there. That it had lost some of its meaning. It had lost some of what makes a city because there was no social life happening. So it was kind of bizarre. And I did think it would come out of COVID and it would suddenly be a deluge of novels set in the UK during lockdown when these streets were completely empty and everything was closed. You could write a really good heist novel, because with nobody on the streets, you could get your way into any jeweler's shop, any bank, and just take what you wanted. Now, that's tucked away in a compartment in my head for later on.
Actually, if you want to see the photos, if you search back through either our YouTube or Facebook platforms in the fall of 2020, I can't remember, Ian, if we spoke about that book in September or October, but one or the other, you can see the photos. One of the interesting things about doing all these virtual events is we have archives, serious archives, and it's nice to be able to go back and refer to them. I don't know if we can ever organize them, maybe by author or something. Be an interesting idea to see if we can do that. Because in some cases we have 4 or 5. Last week, for example, Ian, I did the book launch again for Jeffrey Archer. And, I went back and watched the first one I did because I'd never met him and I didn't know him all that well. We ended up talking to a great degree about what the death of the Queen means. And I told him, and I'll pass it on to you, that the most poignant statement I heard or read anybody had to say, and I don't remember if he was American or British, but as the whole state funeral and the queue and so forth was passing by, somebody said, even in death, she was still working. And I thought, boy, if you really wanted to find, a life of service, I thought that was a remarkable coda to it. I wanted to point out in the front of this book, there's 2 quotes that Ian puts in, and one of them from Mary, Queen of Scots really reflects not only what's going on in the book and with what's going on with Rebus and his companions, but to a great degree what we've been talking about. And she had embroidered on her in French on the clothing she wore shortly before her execution, "In my end is my beginning," which really says a lot about what we've just been talking about. So did you write that, or did you include that after you wrote this book, Ian, or did you start out with that in mind?
I think I had that in mind from fairly early on. In my end is my beginning, because a lot of these later Rebus books are reflecting back to things that have happened in the past, and he's thinking back to when he was a young cop or things that happened to him when he was a younger cop. And that kind of circularity that we've talked about a little bit already is there implicit in the quote. Also, I just want to flag up to people, this was said by Mary, Queen of Scots. This was not said by T.S. Eliot. Most people know the quote because T.S. Eliot used it in one of his poems, "In My End Is My Beginning." And I think a lot of people think he invented it, and obviously he didn't. He nicked it. He nicked it from the Scottish Queen. And yeah, imagine that. You're sitting in your cell and you're about to be executed, and you know you're about to be executed. And she wrote letters to people, and then she also embroidered inside her cloak that she was going to wear to her death this little message, "In my end is my beginning." It's an extraordinarily powerful thing that she did. And I just think it's very moving and poetic. And you know, recently, you'll know this, but you know, recently Denise Mina wrote a very short book, Rizzio, about stuff that happened in the court of Mary, Queen of Scots early on in her lifetime, and that's a very powerful short book. So I'd been reading up a little bit on Mary, Queen of Scots anyway, and I just thought that quote. I thought that was T.S. Eliot. So it was nice to sort of put the record straight.
She wasn't very old. She was in her early 40s, and I've always thought that if you go back and look at, I'm trying to remember, was it Catherine or Marie de Medici, whatever, was so unlucky in her sons, and one of them was the son that married Mary, Queen of Scots. If he hadn't died, she would have stayed in France. She would have been the Catholic Queen of France. She would have been the mother, presumably, of Catholic kings of France, and the whole trajectory of history really would have changed. You know, it was remarkable what one death could actually do. But I was also thinking that you know, it's not just about Rebus going back and looking at his earlier life, his beginning, but thinking ahead to what will come after. I mean, in a way, this is also, I mean, for her anyway, it was a comment on mortality, that though I die, you know, I will live on in some fashion, but then who will come and replace me? And I think those are issues that you're writing about in this book.
Yeah, I mean, Rebus, you know, definitely is wondering what what kind of police force is out there, and so is Siobhan Clarke and Malcolm Fox and everybody else. They're thinking, what have we, the police force that we used to be and the police force we are now and the police force we want to be are very different things. And how do we make one from the other? And how do we live with the mistakes that were made in the past and the terrible choices that were made in the past? So they're all the characters in this book are doing, and you mentioned it tangentially, but Rebus, the kind of story arc for him, the quest that he is on is that Cafferty tells him that there's a petty criminal back in town who everybody assumed that Cafferty had killed years ago. No, this guy's back in town, and can Rebus find him? Can he track him down? And so Rebus is on a quest to find someone from the past as well. And Cafferty wants to meet this guy, wants to see him again. So there's an awful lot that's going to, people thinking back to the way things used to be and the way they used to be, and whether things have necessarily changed for the better. And if they have, how can we stop them going back? Just recently in a newspaper in London at the weekend, there was a story of how the far right have managed to inveigle their way into the police force in the UK. And you're going, well, let's hope that gets stamped down on pretty, if you'll pardon the expression, let's hope that gets stamped down on pretty quickly and pretty thoroughly, because there has been movement towards the extreme right in many cultures in Europe specifically in recent years, and we've even seen it to an extent in the UK. And I would hate for the police force to become, as you mentioned, a paramilitary force.
Look what's going on in Italy.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Italy. I mean, we've got Orban,
Hungary,
we've
Turkey.
got Turkey. Yeah, I mean, it's and even in Scandinavia and Sweden and places, the right wing are on the rise, or seem to be, and it's a very worrying time. And there's chaos, and when you have chaos in politics, or in social life, or in the economy, or in terms of a pandemic, wherever you have chaos, people who have very simple solutions start to get listened to, even if the simple solution is a terrible solution, because people are looking for something they can understand very quickly. And so these demagogues arrive with their simple answers that usually are about blaming somebody else, blaming the other. blaming a culture that is not necessarily your culture. And it's a hellish, worrying time. And the only thing I can do with it is use it as material in my stories. That's how I stop myself from going crazy.
When we were in Odessa in 2011, we made a cruise around the Black Sea. It was incredibly peaceful. There was no real hint of what was coming. And one of the things that actually Rob and I got on a little Russian tour boat and sailed through the Russian Navy, which is anchored in Sebastopol. I could hardly believe it. But at some point when we were talking to some older people, there was a whole let's get rid of Stalin thing, kind of like what's going on with the Civil War generals here and so forth. And I remember this one older woman said to me that she really missed Stalin because you always knew where you were, you know, and emphasizing your point that, you know, she was okay with all the things that were wrong with Stalin because there was certainty in her life. And I think that you're absolutely right. And, you know, considering what's going on in the UK and how Scotland may or may not react to various things, seems to me that you've got an awful lot to chronicle. If you and I manage to live another 10 years or so, you know, this is going to be an astonishing time to write about. And I guess a question for you will be, you know, how much can you anticipate? How much, because every book is out of date really by the time it publishes because it takes so long to write it and get it through the publication process. So how much are you going to be able to, you know, Scotland has another referendum, for example. Can you write about that, or will it, you know, will you need to wait till it's over because otherwise your book may be ridiculous?
I think crime fiction is usually at its best when it's writing about things that happened a while ago. If you think about wherever there's been trouble in the world, violence, violent trouble, violent uprisings. I'm thinking specifically of Northern Ireland here. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, there was precious little, if any, crime fiction being written. Nobody was interested in writing or reading about violence at a time of violence. But when the Troubles calmed down and people came to the table and started to discuss the kind of country they wanted to live in, then the writers emerged, blinking into the light to start to explain what had just happened to readers. And so I think it helps if time has passed. If some time has passed, that allows us to put everything into perspective. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do next. Well, in fact, I do know what I'm going to do next, Barbara. What I'm doing next is taking a year off on pain of divorce. My wife has threatened me with divorce if I don't, because we were supposed to have a year off 2 years ago. And because of COVID, it never happened. And I ended up writing 4 times as much as normal. So she said, right, next year, no festivals, no touring, no writing, no new projects. We're going to go and enjoy ourselves. We're going to do a lot of road trips. We're going to visit a lot of parts of the world we want to visit. And we're just going to have some fun while we still have our wits about us and our knees still work.
You know, that is so powerful. Rob and I just signed up to take a 40-day trip from Ushuaia, Argentina, all the way to Dunedin, New Zealand, across Antarctica. I said to Rob, it'll be our last epic voyage, but it's, you know, it's important.
Never say never. Never say never.
Right. It's important to do it. I don't know that it'll be our last, but you know, if you're coming up on something where at our age, we can no longer say, well, we'll do that someday, you know, because someday might be actually tomorrow for all we know. And so I do think
the difficulty is going to be, I find it very hard to switch off. So, I mean, this new book, Heart Full of Headstones, I'd been trying to write it since August last year. Nothing was happening. January this year, we went on holiday to St. Lucia in the Caribbean, and the idea came. And I got my phone out, and I just started tapping it into my phone, tapping characters, incidents, chronology, you name it. And so every day I was sitting tapping away at this phone. And I got back to Edinburgh late January and just started writing it. So if the ideas, if they want to come, they'll come. I can't stop them coming. So we could be on a lovely vacation somewhere, and I'll be hiding in the toilet, you know, the restroom. And Miranda's going, what the hell is he doing in there? And I'm tapping away at my phone, pretending I'm not working.
Waiting for Miranda to bust you.
Yeah, I know.
That's early.
I'll be sewing it into the inside of my cloak. Sewing the story into the inside of my cloak. That's what we're doing.
You could do that. You could line your jacket or something. You know, there was a really good World War II story about a dressmaker in Lisbon who actually transmitted code in the pattern she made for the dresses, which I think was based on a real incident. So, or you maybe have a suitcase lining where you can, you know, put it all in there. You might even get a second book out of that, which would be a lot of fun. Patrick, are there any questions from the audience before we round out the hour?
Yeah. Well, our good friend Mike Lupica is watching.
Oh, hi, Mike.
He says, it is well documented what an Ian Rankin fanboy I am. But as someone lucky enough to have scored an early copy of Headstones, I will tell you, I believe this is the best book Sir Ian has ever written.
Wow.
Oh, that's very nice. And then we should say, Barbara, that last night John Sanford was, you know, he thought that you might be here live today. He didn't realize it was virtual. He said he would have stayed over to get a chance to talk to you.
So let me point out,
that would have been a great honor.
If we can lure you here, as we have sort of discussed, and don't forget, you know, I may not have that many more occasions to host you, depending on how it all goes.
If you're traveling around the world, if you're traveling around the world, no.
I know, but I'm trying to play upon whatever I can do. Seriously, you know, I said that in something I wrote the other day, that we have to treasure every Rebus and every Harry Bosch novel that comes our way. And, you know, that doesn't relate necessarily to the fate of you and Mr. Connolly so much as what are you going to do with your characters who, you know, have grown old along with us all. But I do think it's important that, you know, that we don't just postpone stuff because it's more convenient. You know, that we need to grab onto. I thought that was a lesson of the pandemic. You know, we need to grab onto those things that really matter to us because life is effervescent. You just, you know, just can't tell. But anyway, should I tempt you over here, John would come because he's just over the border. So that would be even more fun. Yay. What else, Patrick?
Well, kind of apropos what you were just saying. Ginger says, I would love to read about a younger Rebus after he's been on the force for just a couple of years. Have you thought about going back and investigating that?
You know, I would have said that I didn't feel like writing historical novels, which of course is what that would be, until I did the McIlvanney book. And the McIlvanney book that I finished last year, The Dark Remains, was set in 1972 Glasgow. So it was a historical novel. And it was really enjoyable for many reasons, and not least because I could strip out all the stuff that is a complete pain in the derriere for contemporary crime writers. No cell phones, no CCTV, no computers, no DNA analysis of the crime scene. The post-mortem examination is very straightforward, etc., etc. So it was like good old-fashioned policing, you know, out in the streets, meeting your contacts, chatting away, with none of the kind of modern inconveniences. Because, you know, if you're a crime writer now, writing about now, you've got to be, you're alert to the fact that your readers are going, well, why don't I just check the victim's cell phone? Yeah. Why don't I just go, oh, look, the CCTV on that wall. Why don't I just go and check the CCTV? Oh, somebody was taken away in a car. Just look at the road evidence, all the cameras on roads and stuff, and find out where they were taken. Just, you know, the DNA, get to the crime scene and check the DNA, and you'll find somebody's left some traces somewhere. So
check the suspect's Facebook page.
Yeah, really, I know. All that. So, you know, check their bell on their front door, because it'll show you who the killer was walking in through the door. It's just insane. So I've made it okay. I've made it okay with myself to write a historical Rebus novel.
You give it a hell of a soundtrack too.
I'm not saying, oh, a great soundtrack, obviously, Patrick. But I'm not saying I'll do it. I'm not saying I'll do it. But if I got a good idea, and I would love to actually, as I've said, go back and write about that more macho Rebus when he was younger and he was much more dangerous. He was much more physical. He never gets in fights now because he would lose. But that kind of physical, macho, dark, brooding, dangerous Rebus of the early books. If we could get back to the first book, must be set in about 86, 87. That's when it was published. So I'd go back maybe a few years before that,
Would this be the same world essentially that David Peace was writing about in those Yorkshire Chronicles?
Yeah, he started
at least the same cop culture.
Yeah, I mean, he started in 79 and went into the early 80s. So yeah, that's good. So that's my research. I'll just go and read the 4 David Peace novels, and that'll be it. I'll be done. I can
you wouldn't just be writing about a different Rebus, a younger Rebus. You'd also be writing about a very different Scotland. I mean, Glasgow 50, 60 years ago was a radically different city than it is now. I went to visit it in, I think, remember when we were at the Edinburgh, it must 97, I think, when I came to visit you in Edinburgh as part of the Edinburgh Festival. And we went over to Glasgow, and I remember being braced for it being, horrible and dark and full of crime and, and all the rest of it. And I was so surprised that, that it was a different city. But cities evolve just like people. And so it would be interesting for you to be writing about what Edinburgh and or Glasgow, if you wanted to, were like then as opposed to now, because those are characters in your books. I mean, Edinburgh is a big character in your book.
Yeah, I mean, Edinburgh is the main character in my books. And I guess the fortunate thing for me is that I was living in Edinburgh from 1978 onwards. So if I'm setting the book anytime from 1978 on, I've kind of done the research. I've just got to dig back in my memory and also into my diaries. I kept pretty good diaries back then. So I'll and go back and look at the newspapers and stuff, which is what I did for the McIlvanney book. I went back and got the Glasgow newspapers for 1972 and just read them the whole year, to find out what kind of car.
Isn't it unnerving when our lives have turned into history? I had to make that decision with Laurie King's novel that we did the launch for on September 3rd. And it's set in 1970s California. And I realized that when I started the store in 1989, the 1930s were 50 years before. And that was, kind of the bar for historical fiction. Even the 20s seemed slightly too modern for a lot of readers. And now it's 2022 in the 1970s, or 50 years ago. And
yeah, I mean, there are books set in the 70s and 80s that are getting shortlisted for historical fiction prizes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that seems to me like yesterday.
Well, it does, but the bar keeps moving forward in historical fiction. And I think it would be fascinating if you felt like you could find a good story for it, because if you can't, there wouldn't be any point in doing it. But it sounds wonderful. Is there anything else, Patrick, before we let Ian go? Because it's a lot later there than it is here.
Well, it occurs to me that Val's doing something kind of like that too, right? She had the book 1979.
And now she has 1989.
Yeah. Question about the audiobook. Is James McPherson reading the Audible version of this book? Do you know?
I don't know yet. I mean, I would guess that must be in train, but they've not told me who the reader will be. I mean, James is a fantastic audiobook narrator, and he's won prizes for it. He's won several prizes for it for best crime fiction narration. So I would hope. I mean, he's retired. I mean, he was an actor, and he retired from acting, and he took another job, but we kept bringing him back because we love him so much, and he seems to enjoy doing it. So I would hope, touch wood, which my desk is made out of, that we can tempt him back to do this one as well.
Right. Let's see. I hope this isn't a spoiler. Linda says, I've read the book already on NetGalley. When it got to the part where Rebus is about to hear the charge in court, you turn the page and the backstory starts, ... I have to admit, I called Ian a mildly insulting name when I realized I wasn't going to find it out right away. An excellent read. So,
yeah, I mean, I did think that structure was kind of, it's not cheating the reader, but I mean, you're teasing them because you've got a few pages, which is basically Rebus in court, and then suddenly the charge is about to be read out, and then we flick the page and it says, because that all starts with now, flick the page and it says then. And we go back a few months and we start to get into the meat of the story as to why he ended up in the court. And we find out what he was charged with. Yeah. I mean, I tend not to write courtroom scenes because I've got very little idea what happens in an actual courtroom. Usually my books end with somebody being caught, a villain being charged, but we never then go to the trial because that would make it a legal thriller. and that's not my bailiwick, as it were. So it was quite fun. Now, I talked to a few lawyers and got some information from them about what the wording would be like, who would be in the courtroom, who would be doing what. And in fact, yesterday I mailed a copy of the book to each of the lawyers that I'd spoken to. And I did say, look, okay, any mistakes, they're mine, obviously, but thanks for all your help. They didn't want to be named, by the way. They didn't want any acknowledgement.
Okay, maybe as a final question, Tori asks, let's see, ask Ian if he still gets to Bannerman's.
Oh, I remember Tori. Yeah. Do I still get to Bannerman's? It's a bar in Edinburgh that does live music, mostly heavy metal music. It's a kind of dank, dark cellar of a place that just seems to have these rooms going off, endless rooms going off, vaulted ceilings, dripping water from the kind of streets above. No, I've not been to Bannerman's in a long time, a long time. I do remember having a drink with Jackie Leaven in there many years ago after he'd done an event at a venue across the street called The Vaults, which I do sometimes go to. Bannerman's, the kind of music that's in Bannerman's these days is young person's music. It's kind of death metal and heavy metal. I did see a Hawkwind, one of the various branches of Hawkwind played there a while ago. I did go and see that, but that was pre-lockdown. I've not been to Bannerman's since lockdown eased. Maybe I should go back one afternoon.
Well, let me speak up and say warmest congratulations, Sir Ian, on this absolutely wonderful book, 34th in the John Rebus series. Wow. Who would have guessed when we started out almost together that it would come to this? And there we have the British and the American edition. So thank you, Ian. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. When is the book actually published? Patrick, do you have the publication date? The 18th. Never mind. I have.
Yeah.
So we'll just taunt you with this here, back and forth. But there's some advantages to being in the book trade. It's a tough trade, actually. But one of the great things is you do get to hang out with your favorite people and favorite authors and read their books early. Anyway, Ian, good night. Thanks so much.
Thank you, folks. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, Patrick. God bless you
Always
all.
a pleasure.